Good evening. I'm Sherry Negria. I'm chair of the Holocaust Commemoration Committee of the IAUJC. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. Another person on our committee, Richard Rosenfield, and myself will now be reading some stories of local descendants of Holocaust survivors as they light candles. So Holocaust Remembrance Day in Hebrew is called Yom HaShoah. And during this Memorial Day, which is held throughout the world, candles are lit to commemorate the 6 million Jewish victims of the Nazis. Tonight, we are honored to have 6 local descendants of survivors light candles in memory of their relatives who were victims of the Holocaust. Our first candle lighter is Gail Halpern. Gail is the daughter of 2 Holocaust refugees who lost 14 members of their families, including their parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins during the Holocaust. Gail's mother, Laure, was rescued at the age of 15 on a kinder transport from Frankfurt am Main by the Quakers of Northampton in England. Gail's father, at age 19, escaped Berlin only 3 weeks before the war began when he received a work permit to be a tool fitter in a Jewish-run firm in Birmingham, England. Luck played an enormous role for both her parents in escaping the Nazis. Both Gail's parents experienced Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Laure, a 14-year-old, could not attend her Jewish school the next day. Her father was arrested and taken away to Dachau. Erwin, age 18, spent the night wandering in a forested park outside Berlin with his father after they were tipped off by the German wife of a Berlin policeman. They were told not to be at home. Gail Evelyn is named after her 2 grandmothers, Gertrude Gotthelf, who perished in Chelmo in 1942, and Erna Jacobowitz, who died in Auschwitz-Birkenau in February 1943. Gail is the founding coordinator for the IAUJC Holocaust Speakers Bureau, which brings first and second generation Holocaust speakers to classrooms in the Ithaca area. Our second candle lighter is Tovi Yadin. Tovi moved to Ithaca from Israel with her husband and their 3 children last summer, and she works for Siemens Software. All of Tovi's grandparents were Holocaust survivors. She would like to tell the story of her 2 grandmothers. Her maternal grandmother, Dina Lang, was born in Poland in a small village called Ogródzice. She had 4 sisters and 1 brother. All of her sisters, as well as her parents, all of her siblings, as well as her parents, were murdered during the Holocaust. Some of them were taken to Auschwitz and some to Treblinka. Her father was 52 when he was taken, and the youngest brother only 13. She managed to survive the Holocaust and the camps in a miraculous way. She said a lot of it was due to the prisoners heroically helping each other in the camps. After the war, she met my grandfather, Shimon, and they were married and had 3 children. Her paternal grandmother, Chaya Etel, grew up in Lille in France. She had 6 siblings. 3 of them were killed during the war, and so were her parents. Only her brother Avraham, her sister Perla, and herself survived, thanks to the actions of a courageous nun who was later designated as one of the righteous among the nations by the Yad Vashem Museum in Israel. The nun hid them in a sanatorium with 54 other Jewish children. She insisted on keeping a precise journal with the children's date of birth, their real names, and the names of their parents, so that after the war they would all remember that they were Jewish and could go search for their surviving relatives. Tovi's grandmother passed away 2 months ago.
Our third candlelighter is Ayala Shaket. Ayala moved to Ithaca from Jerusalem with her husband and 3 children. She is a theater teacher and currently serves as coordinator of cultural events for the Israeli community in Ithaca. Ayala's grandmother Sarah Shaked, died almost 9 years ago at the age of 101. In 1936, when she was 20 years old, she decided to emigrate to Palestine. Her father, a religious rabbi, sat shiva for her. Grandmother Sarah was fortunate to live a long, joyful, and meaningful life in Israel, in which she established a state and a family. Nevertheless, every day, with much pain and regression, she returned in her imagination to the moment when she forever separated from her father, mother, and little sister. She felt shame for not being by their side in their tragic and unimaginable last moments. There are no traces left of her grandparents' families in Poland. Ayala's father, Shimon Yaakov Shaked, is named after his two grandfathers, who were murdered in the forests. Our fourth candlelighter is Harry Hearing. Harry is a sophomore majoring in global development at Cornell. Harry's grandfather, the youngest of 6 siblings, was born in Warsaw in 1922. When the war broke out in 1939, his family moved to a summer house they had in Radom, Poland, to get away from the calamities of war, hoping that being away from the capital would provide them with some security. In 1941, he and his family were forced into the Radom ghetto, where one of his brothers was killed when doing forced labor. In 1943, his parents and sister were rounded up to go to Treblinka extermination camp. His grandfather was sent to Majdanek, a concentration camp outside Lublin, just after the so-called Harvest Festival, where nearly everyone in the camp was murdered. After Majdanek, he was sent to Plaszow concentration camp outside Krakow. He was able to escape death by using his slight knowledge of electrical work, be useful to the Nazis, and do electrical work for whatever they needed. When the war was coming to a close, and the Allied forces were closing in on Poland in January of 1945, he was sent on a death march with around 900 people who went through Auschwitz and were sent deep into southern Germany, doing forced labor by day and taking open train cars in the frigid temperatures by night. After months on the death march, Harry's grandfather was so weak, he was unable to move his legs and was presumed dead. He woke up in an abandoned barn and saw U.S. Army tanks roll through Bavaria, throw him a loaf of bread, the first real food he had had in months. After the war, he lived in a small Bavarian town for 2 years and then moved to Toronto, where his 2 surviving brothers had immigrated. In Toronto, he met his wife, and they moved to Lakewood, New Jersey, where he worked as an electrician and where he lives today.
Our fifth candlelighter is Amir Longness. Amir is an entrepreneur who moved to Ithaca from Israel with his wife in January. Amir's grandfather, Jacob Longness, was a teenager in the end of 1939 in Berlin. He fought a group of Hitler-Jugend apprentices that mocked and tried to beat him up. His father understood the escalating situation and the potential consequences and decided to send Amir's grandfather to Israel. During his long journey, he was shipped through the Danube. It was one of the coldest winters Europe had known, and his grandfather was among the few who finished that journey alive. The rest of the family were not allowed to leave Germany, and one day the letters stopped arriving. Our sixth candlelighter is Richard Rosenfield. Richard is a cantor who lives in Ithaca. He's a member of Temple Bethel and Tikkun V'or. In 1898, Richard's paternal grandmother's father, Maximilian Lowenthal, emigrated to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, leaving the village of Thalheim, Germany, 7 brothers and sisters and their families. From the book The Jews of Talheim, written by Theodor Nebel, Richard learned that 8 of his descendants perished in the Holocaust. One of them was Lionel Hirschfeld, his grandmother's cousin, who was born in 1880 and was the last cantor in the Thalheim synagogue. His name appears in the pages of testimony in the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. He was arrested in 1938, kept in Dachau, the concentration camp close to Stuttgart, then deported on December 1st, 1941, to the Jungfernhof concentration camp in Latvia. Of the approximately 4,000 people kept in Jugendorf, only 148 survived. Lionel Hirschfeld, like most of the other prisoners of that camp, was für tot erklärt, declared dead. To our candlelighters. It is an honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker now, Severin Drix. Severin was born in a refugee camp outside of Munich, and after the war, he moved to Brooklyn with his parents. Severin first came to Ithaca in 1964 to major in math at Cornell, and he graduated in 1968. He received a Master of Arts in Teaching from Cornell in 1970. He began teaching math at Ithaca High School in 1973, and he still teaches there part-time. Severin's father, Dr. Samuel Drix, was born in Lvov, Poland, which today is Lviv, Ukraine. His father was sent to the Janowska concentration camp on the outskirts of Lvov for 10 months before escaping and being hidden by a Polish Catholic family in a nearby village for 13 months. It has been a privilege for me to get to know Severin over these past few months. As I wrote his story for our media publicity, interviewed him for a local radio show, and read his father's memoir, because my family is from the same part of Eastern Europe. My grandmother is also from Lvov, and as Severin points out, there is not much known about what are called the Galicianer Jews from that part of Poland. Severin believes it is his sacred duty to tell this story because so few Jews survive from that area of Poland. So I'm very pleased to introduce Severin Drix, who will tell us this important story about his family's experience in the Holocaust.
Sherry, and thank you everyone. Thank you for being here and for listening to my story about my father and what he witnessed, what he did, and the person that he was. He was born and raised in Lvov. As Sherry pointed out, that's now Lviv. It was Poland then, it's Ukraine now. That stone, is that still showing, the stone there? Oops. Well, you saw it. I'll go on. That stone is the only evidence that there was a camp there, Janowska camp. Many other places in the West, they had memorial sites. This stone is all there is to show that there was something terrible that happened there. The area, Galicia, was so thoroughly brutalized and massacred, the Jews there, that in 1943, 2 years before the end of the war, the German commander of that region wrote to Hitler that the Galicia is cleansed of Jews. To his knowledge, nobody was left. Very few were. My father, at that point in hiding, was one of the very few. So few survived there that Janowska concentration camp, hardly anybody even knows that name. There were very, very few survivors to tell that story. What enabled the Germans to be so thoroughly brutal there, so complete in their destruction? It was the anti-Semitism of the Poles and the Ukrainians that laid the basis for them to be able to do that with not only the acquiescence of the local population, but sometimes their active support. The further east the Germans went, the more thorough the destruction. So, is this better? Okay, thank you. So, next. A little bit about my father, whose picture you will see in a bit there. He was an extraordinary man, my hero. A tremendous intellect, a memory that was unbelievable. Kindness and compassion, real commitment to his Hippocratic oath as a doctor, and a commitment to serving people with his practice of medicine. Integrity, unshakable, and a deep faith. He also had a will that was amazing. He was we still have the, oh, I'm sorry, that better? Okay, I guess it really has to be pretty extremely close. Okay, should I repeat anything or just go on? Okay, all right. He graduated first in his class in medical school in Lvov. The anti-Semitism in Poland was progressing, and there were only 11 Jews accepted to the university that year, and in a few years, the quota was down to 0. He was also, we'll see soon a picture of him next to his colleague doctors that he was working with. He was taken on as an assistant by the top medical researcher in Poland, shortly after graduating, well over people, his seniors, and worked in research to help him. He was fluent in 10 languages. I can hardly imagine that. And at age 85, he could recite the roll call of his kindergarten. He also was deeply, deeply committed to his family. He had a large extended family. His father had died in World War I in a military hospital during the war. His mother remarried with a widower. And so there were 3 branches of the family that were all very, very close. He had aunts and uncles on his father's side, his stepfather's side, his mother's side, and they all converged frequently at the home that he grew up in. They had 3 children from the first marriage of the mother, 1 child from the stepfather's first marriage before he was a widower, and then 1 that they had together. And they joked, oh, we have yours, mine, and ours. But they were all equally loved and deeply caring for each other. He had 31 aunts and uncles, 25 first cousins, and he had a wife, Franja, and a little daughter, Sylvia. Sylvia was 2 years old when she was sent to the gas chambers in Belzec, as was Franja, as was most of his family. Of the entire extended family, only a few of the cousins survived, none others, including grandparents. And bit by bit, he would hear of others who had passed away, and it just tore at his heart. His first direct experience with the Germans was in June 1941. Germany and the Soviet Union had divided Poland in 1939, and he was in Lvov, which was in the eastern part. In June 1941, the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, attacked the eastern portion, and the Soviet army had to retreat. He was working at that time in a small town outside of Lvov for the summer, with a total of 30 Jewish doctors there. Of those, 15 ended up staying for one reason or another, and 15 went with the Russians who wanted to take these doctors, because they needed them for the war, to go with the army and serve as army doctors. He was on the truck heading back, urged by his friend, his best friend, you have to go. What are we going to do? What could you do for your family anyway? And by the way, at that point, the stories from people who had been in the German-occupied part of Poland sounded bad, but not like, a genocide. And it didn't seem that much worse than living under the Soviets and Stalin. But he said, no, I have to go back. Maybe I won't be able to do anything, but I have to try. I have to be there for my family. So at the first occasion, when they came to the next town, he got off that truck and was able to make his way eventually back to Lvov, where his family was. Of the 15 who stayed, he was the only one that survived. Of the 15 who went back with the Soviet army, all but one made it. One had died in military action. The other 14 lived. When he was back, are we seeing any pictures? Oh. Oh, well, maybe at the end we'll run through the pictures. I will continue, if it's okay with you. When he was back in Lvov, he went to his apartment and was there with apartments shared with several members of his family, of course, his wife and daughter, but his parents. It was a reasonably, decent neighborhood, but it became part of the ghetto. And when it was part of the ghetto, horrible things happened. They happened before then. There were terrible pogroms by Ukrainian militias, egged on by the Germans, allowed to do what they were doing. And then once the Germans themselves were committing many, murders and beatings. The ghetto, when it was closed in, there was the main entrance to the ghetto. We have a picture of it. We went there, myself and my wife Pamela, and my parents and our two young children, two young boys. We went in 1994, the very summer when the book was published. We celebrated it by making a trip back to Poland and Ukraine, to Warsaw, where my mother had grown up, and to Lvov. And anyway, we have a picture of this bridge. It's a causeway. There's an opening underneath. It looks like an arch there, but it's like a train line or something. And it's called Under the Bridge. It was called Under the Bridge by the Jews there. It was the main entrance to the ghetto. And walking in or out of the ghetto, one was subject to, first of all, having your papers checked, but worse than that, maybe being selected to be killed right then and there, or just being beaten, to an extreme degree. It was a terror for the members, the residents of the ghetto. The next couple of pictures were of the apartment where my father lived at the time and his older sister's apartment across the street. I guess I didn't go through, we had pictures of the various different, three sisters and the brother. We'll get to that at some point, I hope. But anyway, so when the Germans did the action, there were a series of actions, and actions was the German word for it. It was worse than pogroms, which were, sporadic outbursts. This was systematic. The streets were closed. There was no way to get out. Apartment after apartment was searched thoroughly. And then if you had the right papers, maybe they would let, work papers, maybe they would let you go, and maybe they would ignore that and take you anyway. If you didn't have the papers, you were taken. Taken where? Taken to the concentration camp Janowska, and for most, it was a short stop from there to Belzec, to the gas chambers. My father had been trying to avoid detection. He had his medical bag. He was saying he was on his way to a patient, but he saw that there was no way out, so he stood outside his apartment to see if any of his family was taken. He was going to go join them. But before anything like that happened, he was spotted, he was captured, he was taken, and along with many others, he was transported to the Janowska concentration camp. We also have a picture of the Klepperov railway station across near the camp. Ah, it's happening? Okay. They say to err is human, but to really mess it up, you need a computer. Well, let me know what's showing. I guess I'll see it. What's that? It's not showing up on my view. Here we go. Okay, yes, that's my father. Long after all this, when he was living in New York City, where he eventually settled, He spent his last couple of years here in Ithaca. All right, next. Yeah, let's go. Oh, is that hard to do? I'm sorry. I figure I'll let the pictures catch up to where we were in the story. If it's too hard, I'll just continue. Keep going, okay. So Janowska. Janowska was a labor camp, a transit camp, and an extermination camp, all three. A transit camp to the gas chambers of Belzec, which existed only for the gas chambers. There was nobody working there or living there, other than the people manning the chambers. And Klepperov railway station is where, right near the Janowska camp, is where they were put onto the train that went to Belzec. We have a picture of my father and I there, and at that point, he started thinking about his mother, who was put on one of those trains. And shortly after we took the picture, he was in tears. It was also a labor camp. Those who were not selected, and the selection, by the way, all women, no matter what age, were sent to the gas chambers. In some of the camps further west, they could work, they could at least hope that maybe they would survive, and some of them did, but in Janowska, all the women were sent to the gas chambers, all the children, all the men over age 45. Of those under age 45, but of working age, if they looked sickly or crippled or otherwise unfit, they also went to Belzec. Of the ones who were selected to stay, the so-called lucky ones, they were formed in brigades. Yes. It was working a little while ago. Should I continue now? Oh, wait, I'm being told I should wait a little bit. Thank you all for your patience. Ah, okay. All right, so that's the doctors, and my father is in the back row. Oh, okay. Hang on. So sorry. I promise you it was working before we came, and it was working earlier before you guys came, so some little evil sprite must have made its way inside. If it's all right with you, I think I should continue while this is going on, yeah? So the workers who were there, the inmates who became workers, were formed in groups called brigades, with one of the Jews was in charge of the brigade, was the brigadier, which was a dangerous thing, because if any of the brigade escaped en route to or from work or otherwise, the brigadier was responsible for that. So every morning they would line up in their brigades, as if it was military brigades, in the great square there, for roll call and registration, and this sometimes went on for hours, sometimes in the freezing cold, sometimes in the very hot sun. And the brigades then, when the roll call was on, they marched out through the gate of the camp on their way to work, depending on which brigade. They went to different work sites, and these were basically sites that produced goods that were used for the military effort. They were needed. And this was the battle in the German hierarchy. How much do we need the labor? How much do we want to exterminate them? And there were different sides to that. Anyway, so they went, and some of the work sites were terrible, where the work was extremely onerous and where they were harassed and beaten if they weren't working properly fast enough, or if they thought, wait, this person is ill, they would maybe even shoot him. And some were much better, where they were doing the work, but the people in charge there monitoring them were more kind, or at least not unkind. And so that's what they did to those brigades. It was also an extermination camp because besides the work that they had to do, there were regular murders in the camp by the SS for whatever reason, a whim, or because they suspected somebody had tried to escape, and sometimes brutal torment before the murder, hangings, shootings. Sometimes groups were taken out to a place called the Sands, which was northwest of the camp, where they were shot and then buried in a mass grave. And that happened repeatedly. Almost every day there was a group sent out to the Sands. The life expectancy in the camp was about 2 to 4 weeks on average, unless you had some help from outside. Help from outside was especially hard if you came from a surrounding countryside. But for people whose family was in Lvov, if they dared to go in the street knowing where your brigade was marching and tried to risk themselves to go and give you a piece of bread or some medicine or something like that, you had a chance to survive, a better chance to survive. My father managed to survive for over 10 months in the camp. And part of this was because at sometimes he was allowed to be the doctor for a group rather than doing hard physical labor. At times, no doctors were allowed. The head of the camp said, doctors, no doctors, Jews are all filth and need to die. The other reason why people died in the camp was because of typhus and other diseases, but typhus especially. The sanitation was unimaginable. Everybody had lice. The barracks were crowded one on top of the other. People defecated and urinated in the barracks because they were afraid to go outside, because for sport, SS men might be there waiting to catch people who were on their way to a lavatory and beat them senseless. In all of this, many people, as I said, got typhus, and one day it happened to my father also. His typhus lasted over 2 weeks. His temperature at the highest was 108 degrees. And being a doctor, he also there was a camp doctor, and there was an infirmary, but you had like a dozen beds or so, and every few days the SS would come in, take everybody off the beds, and take them out to be shot. So he knew better than to go there, but the doctor could provide him with some medicine. He got injections, and I'd never heard of this as a medicine, strychnine and caffeine injections to help his heart and get him through this, and it did help. But he had such an extreme fever that he was delirious at times. He couldn't read, couldn't understand what was in front of him. He could try to write, his hands wouldn't write. He had trouble hearing. But during all of this, of course, he couldn't go to an infirmary, so he had to go to work, and at that time, at the beginning of it at least, he was in a very hard labor spot where he had to lift large rocks and boulders, and if the guard there saw him shirking, then he would be shot right there and then. He had to try his best to not do anything when the guard wasn't looking, and then, look like he was doing something and actually do something. Should I go through these now? Are we fixed here? All right. So I think we were, if you go to the one before, I think we were there at that one. Yes, we were at my father. Go to the next one. I think you saw the medical doctors, my father being third from the left in the back. Go on to the next one. Yes, this is his younger brother, Yuzek, who my father sometimes was significantly... What's that? There are two people here. Yuzek on the left. Oops. Okay. All right. Then I'm seeing the next one. We got the pictures, but they're not coordinated. All right. I'll keep in mind to think of the last one. It's better than not seeing them at all, isn't it? There we go. Is that what you're seeing now? The brother and his sister, one of his three sisters. By the way, all three of his sisters sacrificed their lives trying to save members of their family, all three of them. But my father was one of the first taken, so he ended up not being able to help any of them at all. He would hear of them being taken or see them come through the camp and being selected. There was nothing he could have done. So Yuzika's younger brother, my father was in some ways like a father to him. Gina was she survived longer than the others, but was eventually also taken. All right, next. The other two sisters are in the next photo, the group photo. Are you seeing it yet? Because I'm not seeing it yet. All right, you see a whole group of people? Yeah, it's back. Okay. I'm not seeing it yet. Oh, it's fine. Just you tell me what's there, I'll tell you what it is. Okay. On the left, the furthest to the left is his younger sister, Ida. And on the right, second from the right, is his older sister, Ruja, the one who lived across the street from his apartment. He loved them all very, very dearly. Others there's some cousins and a lot of friends, and this is taken before the war. And again, one of the cousins there was one of the few who survived, none of the others. All right, the next one. Yes, that's his wife, Franja, and his little daughter, Sylvia. I will say one more thing here. When they got the word that my father was in Yanovska, they hadn't known. They knew he had disappeared. They didn't know. When they found out from a Jewish policeman who let them know, Franja at first was in joy that he was alive, my father was alive. And then realizing what it meant to be in Yanovska, she burst into tears, and a little 2-year-old Sylvia said, "Oh, don't worry, Mommy. Daddy will come back. Daddy will come back." Well, he did survive, but unfortunately they didn't. All right, move on to the next. The bridge, that's under the bridge. I already talked about it. Okay, there it is. And that's on the left is the apartment. My father is standing near it, where he lived with his family. And on the right is across the street where his older sister, Ruja, lived. Okay, again. And this is where he was caught and taken to be with a group of others and eventually put on transit to Yanovska. Yanovska is on the outskirts of Lvov, at the end of the street of Yanov. And this is the Klepperov railway station where the trains took people to Belzec, and where my father just broke into tears remembering his mother. And this is the map of the Yanovska camp. My wife drew it under the direction of my father, who did this from memory. And it's in the book right near the beginning, if you do have the book or purchase it today. And the numbers here, I don't know if it's big enough to see the numbers, but in the facing page, the numbers are explained what specifically they were. I will say that up in the upper left, it leads to the sands where people were taken out to be shot and buried. And at the bottom is the entry to the camp, and near it is the place called Behind Wire. It's a section, it was like a row that heads out to the sands, and where people who they decided would be selected either because of some supposed malfeasance that they had done, like trying to run away or something else, or not working properly or whatever, or there were other reasons. People were selected out and put there. And if you were there between those wires, you knew this was the end of your life. When the last brigade marched out, they would be taken out to the sands and shot. And one day, my father, this is after he had gone through the typhus. And by the way, after the typhus, he was able to have medicine smuggled in. His mother risked her life to see him on his way to and from the work. And he had medicine smuggled in, he and some other doctors who were there, and they treated the inmates with whatever they had and saved quite a few lives, of course, for the long term. Not really, but certainly at least for then. But after all that, sometime later, he was selected to go behind wire, and he was already saying his prayers and saying goodbye to the world, saying, "I have not lived, this is my whole life. ahead of me gone. But after the last brigade went out, any moment now he would be with the others taken out for slaughter. A limousine pulls up, and in it is the commander of a nearby work camp called Orgtot. And this commander of that work camp was actually a fairly kind person. It was a work camp. He was a cement works, and certainly he took advantage of the slave labor, but he did not torment the people who worked there. And he had come there because a sudden shipment had come in, and he needed more workers. There was already a group there, but he needed more. And he went to the camp commander, who was a close friend of his, the concentration camp commander, and he said, I need more workers. A shipment came in. What do you have? He said, well, the last brigades have left, but you can take these people, but keep an eye on them. So they were saved miraculously. If that limousine had come earlier, there'd be people from a brigade. Later, they'd be dead already. So when he was on there, they were still scared. What happens after the day's work? What happens to them? But he turned to them and he said, don't worry, don't be afraid. Nothing will happen to you. And maybe he intervened with the camp commander, or maybe it was just lost in the chaos that often happened. But when they got back after a day's work, they weren't pulled aside. They went to the barracks, and nothing eventually came of it. So many times my father was miraculously saved. Many times he expected any moment his death. Certainly during typhus, at many occasions when his strength was feeling like it gave out, but his will kept him going. Much worse later. They were all in roll call, and it was a very strange day, different, re-registering the groups, rearranging the groups. Something bizarre was going on. My father at that point was in a very good position. He was in a labor group, a brigade, that was in a very advantageous, work situation where they were treated decently by the people at that place. I think we've gone too far forward. Yeah, let's keep this for a while at the camp. But anyway, he also was working as a doctor there. But he felt something was wrong. There was something in the smirk on the camp commander's face, that he felt an intuition, like a hand was pushing him. He walked from across the parade grounds from his brigade to another brigade. In fact, the brigade that was going to go to Orgtot. And the brigadier said, what are you doing here? Get out of here. And of course, my father risked his life. Just if he had been seen leaving a brigade to go to another one, he would have been shot. And he said, no, please let me stay with your brigade. He says, well, I don't need a doctor here. That's fine. I'll just work as a cement worker like everyone else. And he was right. 3/4 of the inmates were killed on that one day. As the brigades marched out, the brigades that were chosen for slaughter, and some of them were in highly respected, highly important to the military places, didn't matter. They were put on trucks guarded by soldiers and SS men and driven off to their doom. My father's brigade was one of that lucky 1/4. And after this, it got even better for him because the Orgtot brigade was going to be housed at the Orgtot worksite for some period of time. Of course, they didn't know how long, but they knew it wasn't going to be forever. My father swore at that point, as he was being taken out the next day to stay in Orgtot with the other of the brigade. As he walked through the gates, he said, I will never pass through this door again except as a corpse. And he vowed he was going to make his escape from Orgtot because it was his only chance. And when he was at Orgtot, the conditions there were enough to lull you. I mean, they worked, but they were treated decently. But he knew this is temporary. And he and 2 others made a plan. The 2 others came from a small village some distance away. And they said they know some people there that might be sympathetic, that could hide them. Because what are you going to do if you're going outside? And people, first of all, risk their lives to help you. And secondly, some of them don't even want to help you. And that might even report you and turn you in. So they were hoping to get some help there. They left the camp by crawling along the train tracks where the trains come in with supplies so that they could get under the gate that had been closed. And they were walking, pretending, because there were also workers there that were not Jews, that were not housed there, and they were pretending to be those. But there was a guard at the guardhouse there that looked at them, looked like, And, at any moment he might have shouted to them to come back, or shot at them, or shot if they didn't come back. Another miracle, a heavy downpour, a torrential rain. The guard jumped back into his booth, and my father and the two others ran to the nearby forest where they were heading, and they managed to escape. Now comes a long journey to get to the village that they were heading towards. Along the way, one of the other two men was spotted and shot. My father and the other man managed to escape that event and came to the village, and they came to the house of a family called the Zavers, who risked their lives, and they had two young children. And they risked it all. They said, no, we have to help them. And so they kept my father and the other man alive for 13 months. 13 months. They had to provide food very, very carefully and only a little at a time so that, nobody would be suspicious. Why are they taking food over there? They couldn't have the two Jews in their house. That was way too dangerous. Who knows who would come knocking at the door? At one point, my father and the other man were in the upstairs of the stable. But even there, at different times, they had to move from one place to another because this place became more dangerous, that place became more dangerous. There was a time when the Germans, while retreating, were housing inside their house, and they were right near the stable. They'd go there sometimes to get, something or other. So my father and the other man had to keep moving locations from one to another, and sometimes back again, depending on what they were told is, oh, this is too dangerous for you now, or what they discovered was too dangerous. One of these times, my father is trying to move at night, and in the moonlight, he's lit up, and suddenly he's being shot at from across a river, but he couldn't see where they were because that was hidden in trees, but they could see him. He lay flat, bullets were whizzing by his face, and again, for the umpteenth time, he's saying, this is my last day, I'm about to die. But again, clouds came over the moon. It was dark enough that he could run and make it. After all of this, finally, the Soviet army came and liberated that region. Now, after liberation, he knew he had already heard about all of the immediate members of his family having been taken and killed. But he still hoped to find some of his family to make life worth living. Lists went around. People were signing lists with their names, and lists would pass, and he kept looking, hoping to see a name he recognized. Nothing. And so he had a collapse, a health collapse. He had had typhus, he'd had pleurisy, he'd had near starvation for 10 months in the camp and 13 desperately hiding. And his body finally just gave in, and he didn't have that much will to live at this point. He went to the hospital. At one point, he saw the doctor passing by his bed and just wave his hand like, no hope for this one, and move on to the next bed. And in that situation, he was saved by the fact that some of his cousins had survived, found out that he was alive, found out where he was, and they came to his bedside. And that gave him a will to live again, something to have a joy for. All right, I think we can move to the next. This is my father after his recovery from that health breakdown after the war. Of course, still overwhelmed with the grief of all that he had lost, all the people that had mattered so much to him. Next. My father and my mother fell in love with each other. A little bit about my mother. She was born in Warsaw in the German side, the part that became occupied by Germany before, when Poland was split. She had fallen in love with my father's favorite cousin, Milek, and they actually got married. And when Poland was divided, she followed him back to the eastern part, the Soviet-held part, to Lvov, which unfortunately, that was the last time she saw her parents, her brother, and some other relatives. They all perished, and she doesn't even know how. There was no communication possible. All she knew was that after the war, they didn't show up on any of the lists. When she went to Lvov, she could pass for an Aryan. She did not look Jewish. And unlike men, where if they suspected you, they could just see if you were circumcised, she didn't have to worry about that. So she had an apartment, and she hid 4 Jews there, including Milek, whom they had married, but it didn't last, and in like a couple of weeks, they annulled the marriage. It just didn't work. It wasn't even a divorce, it was just an annulment. So she hid him and 3 others. But she also, one day on the street, she saw a Jewish woman being beaten by the SS, and she begged them to stop. And they looked at her and said, "If you want to save a Jew, maybe you are a Jew." So she spent 2 months in an SS prison, after which they decided, well, they'll let her go and have her sent back to Germany. And the army officer who was taking her back to be put on a train had pity on her and let her go. But she had to leave Lvov because she would be recognized there. So she moved to Krakow, working hard to earn money to provide food for the 4 people hidden in her apartment, making frequent trips back and forth to deliver food so that they would survive, and they all survived. For this, she was given an award at a ceremony among other people who saved people in the Holocaust, an award given by the State Department. So they married, they left Poland illegally, crossing a couple of borders till they ended up in West Germany. And that's where I was born, outside of Munich, in a refugee camp. I think we can go to the next one now. This is my parents shortly after their marriage. And this is my mother with me, the newborn. And some joy on her face. And this really, that marriage, my mother gave my father a real reason to live. And then, of course, a child. Next. And this is the 3 of us before we all ended up in the United States. In the United States, my father had a very wonderful career as a doctor. I looked through the thank you cards that he got from patients who just, were so grateful to him and said, many of them said, "You saved my life." But besides working in private practice with his patients, he also, to his surprise, ended up working for the German consulate. They had called him to examine patients, survivors, for their medical conditions to see what level of reparations they would get. And he said to them, he wasn't expecting to work from them, and to put them off, he said, "I'm a survivor too. I'm going to give them everything they could possibly get unless there's clear cases of fraud." And they said, "Good, that's what we're looking for." So he ended up, and my father never generalized. Yes, there were Ukrainians who had done horrible things. It was also an Ukrainian man who tried desperately to save several members of his family, but it didn't work. There were Poles who were doing horrible things, but it was a Polish Catholic family that saved him. And there were these Germans here who, really were caring about the survivors and wanted to make what amends they could. He worked for them until he was 90 years old, in a varying capacity as he got older. And he was eventually given an honor by the German government for his service. Also, next picture, please. He eventually was able to reconnect with Mrs. Zaver. In this picture, this is when we were in Poland in 1976. I think I was the one taking the picture. My father's on the left. Next to him is Mrs. Zaver. And next to her is my mother. And the rest of the people are Mrs. Zaver's family, including her little grandchildren. Shortly after the Soviets took over that region on their way westward, a Ukrainian militia killed all the Polish men in the village. And she was told that she had 24 hours to leave with whatever she could take with her and her 2 small children. And she ended up in the western part of Poland, but they were trying to clear all the Poles out of that region to be part of the new Ukraine. And I'll say again, my father, seeing the Ukraine of today, would be totally behind them, would be totally supportive of Ukraine today, totally. And Putin uses what some of them had done in the past as an excuse for his war. My father would see right through that. Anyway, he couldn't find out where she went, and he wanted so much to repay the generosity, the risk that she had taken. Eventually, in the United States, with the help of the American consulate in Poland, he found out where she lived. He had an address. He sent her money. He sent her food and clothing and other things. Life in Soviet Poland was very, very hard. Her response was, Doctor, you don't have to do this. You don't owe me anything. I only did what a normal human being would do. He was so touched by her humility, but he kept giving things. And he also gave the story to Israel, and Yad Vashem honored her as a righteous among nations. And the ambassador to Poland came to her house to give her her award. My father also was a witness in 2 war crimes trials. The first one in the 60s was a travesty of justice. He was bitterly unhappy about the outcome of that trial. Minor sentences to major criminals. But in the second one, in the 1970s, he was able to give testimony that convicted the most brutal sadist of all the SS in Janowska camp. And he has got a letter from the judge, which I have seen recently, I was looking at it again, saying it was your exact testimony that enabled the conviction of this man to the highest sentence that Germany has, which is life imprisonment. But on the other hand, he looked around at the world and he saw the news, and he says, the world has learned nothing. After all of this, you would think people would know better than to have these hatreds and this persecution. But when the killing fields of Cambodia was in the news, when the genocide in Rwanda, and we're all here today knowing that we have a mission too, to do what we can to stand up against hate, for understanding, for justice. Even today, you had to register here, right? Because we're worried about security, because of shootings in synagogues. This is not over, and we have a duty. And it was for my father a sacred duty, and one of the reasons he wrote his book. Next pictures, we're almost done. When the book was published, this was the picture of myself and my wife Pamela, and my parents in front, and then on the left in front, our son Julian, and on the right, our younger son Nathaniel. Next. My father, showing the humorous and loving side of himself. He really had joy, and he managed to find a positive way to live in spite of all he had been through. And he lived to age 96. He expected he would only live to maybe 40, 50. Yeah, he lived to 96. And lastly, this is my older boy, Julian, at the graveside where we had just buried my father. And I want to conclude with some thank yous. First and foremost, to my wife, Pamela. If not for her, the book would not probably ever have been written. My father was so busy with his work as a doctor. He just couldn't find the time, and she gave him as a present for Father's Day a little tape recorder. On your holidays, just talk, because he loved talking about what had happened. He felt so important that it be told, and groups of friends would gather around him to hear these amazing stories. So he would just do it to that. And eventually, he was doing it in Polish, it was transcribed, and it was translated, and then my wife Pam did most of the editing until I was able to join in the later stages. She did yeoman work there. And also, I want to thank the Grunberg family here in Ithaca, Sarah, Carolina, and Wanda, who helped my parents both when they were in a nursing home here towards the end of their life. And my father at that point only could speak in Polish. He had gotten to that point, and they were taking care of him, and, as companions, and able to speak with him in Polish. And by the way, Wanda helps us stay in touch with the Zaver family. Mrs. Zaver is no longer alive, but we are in some touch with the other members of the family, and we met them, we went over to visit them. And language barrier, so they translate for us. It does on phone calls. Thank you all very, very much. I don't know if there's time. Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Severin. Thank you all for your patience. A few technical difficulties, but thank you to Todd Olson for finding a solution. And to and to two people who I don't know their names for helping with fixing it. We have a couple more things. The youth of Temple Bethel would like to give a very brief presentation about a Holocaust scroll that we have in the back of our synagogue. So I would like to introduce Audrey Green. She's a student in the Ithaca Noir class in Temple Bethel's religious school. She's a 9th grader at Ithaca High School, and she will be speaking about a PowerPoint now.
Hi. Okay, so this is TBE's Holocaust Torah. It is right back there in the wooden case near the main door, I guess. Okay. Next slide. There we go. Okay, so this Torah is from the community of Kutna Hora in what was then Czechoslovakia, but is now the Czech Republic. And the town had a population of about 20,000 people. For about 300 or so years, there were no Jews allowed in the town until somewhat close to the war. And by the time the war was over, and today there's no more Jewish community there. The synagogue is now a church, but it was a factory during the war. The Star of David is still visible from outside. There are now statues in it, which make it, I guess, not kosher anymore. This is the concentration camp that was closest to Kutna Hora. It's called Terezin, and it was about 30 miles north of Prague. This specific camp held mostly people from Czechoslovakia, along with people from Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and Denmark. It was not a death camp. It was mostly a transportation camp, sort of between other concentration camps, but it was also what was used by the Nazis to show, like, the Red Cross and other organizations that they were supposedly taking care of people. This was helped by the fact that there are many musicians, artists, and scholars kept there. And the Nazis were able to make it look like all of the camps were like this, even though we all know that that was very far from the truth. This is a book that is in TBE's library called I Never Saw Another Butterfly, and it is a book of poems and pictures drawn and written by children in Terezin from 1942 to 1944. And finally, our Torah, it is number 722 out of the Czech Memorial Severin Torah. There are many others in other communities from Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia, and are now all over the world. The Memorial Scrolls Trust is the organization that collects them and distributes them to communities similar to ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. I would now like to call Richard Rosenfield. He will be singing the prayer El Mala Rachamim, which means God full of mercy. It is traditionally sung at a Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day service.
So for this prayer, please use the handout. It has the right words. And it is customary to rise. El male rachamim shochein bamromim ametzei menucha nechona tachat kanfei HaShekhinah במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל שנטבחו בשואה אנשים, נשים וטף שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם אנא בעל הרחמים, אסתירם בשאת כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני הוא נחלתם. וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם ונאמר אמן.
And we would like to close with the singing of Hatikva. Please remain standing. This is the national anthem of Israel, and Tovi will be leading us in this.
כל עוד בלבב פנימה נפש יהודי הומי פתי מזרח קדימה עין לציון צופיה עוד לא אבדה תקוותנו התקווה בת שנות 2000 להיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון וירושלים להיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון וירושלים.
Be seated. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Severin Drix, our keynote speaker, and all of you who participated tonight to make this. I want to thank everyone, our speakers, our audience, to help us mark this day of remembrance. We do have refreshments downstairs,